It was 5:30 on the morning of December 17, 1944. Frost rimed the road. A half-light smeared through the pines around Hansfeld. Engines coughed, then died. A single Tiger tank, its silhouette hunched against the cold, rattled to a stop, as if some invisible hand had pulled its breath away. Soldiers climbed down, hands numb, breath steaming. The commander, referred to in some interrogations as Piper, to verify, banged on the engine housing and swore at the Maybach's dead heart. No fuel reading, empty tanks, cold metal. The war, in that instant, was reduced to something the crew could feel with their fingertips, the absence of gasoline. They moved toward the nearest supply point, more out of instinct than strategy. What they found there struck them first as salvation, then as something else entirely. Pyramids of jerry cans rose from the snow, neat ranks stretching like a field of metal flowers. They pried open one, smelled benzene, a sharp, clean sting, and laughed with the relief that has the shape of desperation. Men began siphoning, pouring, sloshing. A handful of cans could wake an engine. 100 could push a company forward. 50,000 gallons, the manifest would later read. 50,000 gallons that might, momentarily, bring a tiger back to life. But the small celebration didn't last. A soldier found a stack of papers, shipping manifests, dates, and the folded pages of Stars and Stripes, its ink still fresh, the headlines about rear area comforts and new offensives. They read where the fuel had come from and when it had moved. The numbers on the manifest did not point to Providence. They pointed to a machine far larger than any crew or company, factories and refineries, convoys and pipelines that could produce and move fuel by the millions. 1 can, 1 barrel, 1,000 gallons. Suddenly those measures of individual need became meaningless in the face of a rival defined by production capacity. It felt like staring at a thing that wasn't human, a German interrogate later said, hands rubbing at the cold, eyes gone blank. Not because it was a miracle, because it showed a power that ate men's work and breath, and still spat out fuel. This is the image that hooks the Ardennes that winter. A dead engine, a stack of cans, a paper manifest, and the dawning comprehension that the enemy they had faced all along was not only men wearing uniforms. It was also an industrial organism, a network of factories, pipelines, and disciplined convoys, whose scale rendered heroics and cunning secondary to cubic feet and barrels per day. If you follow military history for the long threads beneath the battle's flashy days, this is the moment to pause. Hold that smell of benzene. Remember the timestamp, 0530, 17 December 1944. A single can of gas can keep a man warm. 50,000 gallons can change a campaign's calculations.
But the discovery at Hansfeld would become, for those German soldiers who saw it, an uncomfortable revelation about the war's true center of gravity. If this kind of deep historical reconstruction interests you, consider subscribing. There's more on supply, pipelines, and the convoys that kept armies moving in the companion pieces. They drank the fuel as if it could mend what scarcity had broken. They siphoned and refueled, coaxing life back into metal beasts. Yet as officers cross-checked manifests and the prints of American convoy stamps, a different picture emerged. These cans were not a windfall that could change fronts. They were detritus of a supply system whose daily arithmetic dwarfed the needs of a single unit. 50,000 gallons, impressive to a crew on empty, was a rounding error next to the millions that flowed toward Allied front lines. The manifest read like an index, a ledger of abundance. Men who had measured every liter for months suddenly felt the world tilt under a new unit of measure, industrial throughput. To understand why that ledger mattered, and why the sight of stacked jerry cans could be so soul-sapping, you have to step back from the frozen mud and hold the campaign in a wider frame. War in 1944 was not fought solely on the embattled hills or in officers' plans. It was fought in refineries in Texas and Louisiana, in tank factories in Ohio and Detroit, in the tangle of undersea pipe laid by engineers from Britain across the English Channel. The front line was dependent, more than any infantryman liked to admit, on the invisible companions of victory. Barrels, truck-ton miles, kilometers of pipe, fuel drum counts. Consider the simplest logistical unit, the jerry can. Holding roughly 5 imperial gallons, about 20 liters, it was a compact bit of industrial geometry, stamped metal, a handle, 3 chambers to prevent sloshing, designed for quick carrying and rapid pouring. For a German panzer crew, a dozen cans could mean the difference between mobility and immobilization. For an Allied supply plan, 50,000 gallons was a single bulwark in a constant tide. One tank might drink 50 to 100 gallons to move and fight for a day. An entire armored brigade demanded tens of thousands of gallons daily. Numbers that seemed vast on a snow-swept roadside dwindled on the ledger of total consumption. The Americans had turned petroleum into a strategic lever. They had, by 1944, assembled networks to get that oil from well to wheel with a level of redundancy and scale the Wehrmacht could hardly match. 2 names stand out among the systems that moved fuel, the Red Ball Express and Pluto. The Red Ball Express was not a single unit, but an idea made kinetic, prioritized truck convoys running on fixed routes, round the clock, with a single mission: supply the front.
Its drivers, largely African-American soldiers, drove under blackout conditions through bombed-out bridges and winter slicks to keep rubber on the ground at the pace demanded by tanks and Allied formations moving inland. Truck after truck rolled, day and night. The sign system that marked the Red Ball route turned cities into arteries, with warehouses emptied and refilled like the pulsing chambers of a heart. Pluto, pipelines under the ocean, was an astonishing technical answer to a strategic problem. British engineers, working with American planners, laid flexible pipelines across the channel to deliver fuel directly to the continent. In a campaign where ports could be shelled, where piers could be destroyed and tankers sink, Pluto reduced reliance on vulnerable shipping and provided a steady, if initially limited, trickle of petroleum to the beaches and onward to depots. It wasn't glamorous, it didn't win Hollywood battles, but it turned offshore oil into inland life. Put these systems together and the arithmetic changes. Archive logistics reports from the period record Allied daily fuel consumption in Northwest Europe at roughly 1.2 million gallons, with deliveries often cited at around 1.4 million gallons per day during peak supply efforts. Those figures appear in manifested convoy reports and quartermaster summaries. In the mind of an exhausted German tanker confronting a stack of jerry cans in the middle of a snowfield, such numbers read like a declaration. The enemy could and did manufacture forward motion. The Allied industrial apparatus produced at a scale the Axis powers could not meet. Strategic production figures, reported in quartermaster and armament records of the time, place Allied petroleum and crude output in orders of magnitude greater than the German synthetic capacity. For perspective, the German war economy, forced into synthetic fuel production as Allied bombing and blockade strangled conventional oil access, produced on the order of tens of millions of barrels per year. Allied refinement and delivery counted in the hundreds of millions and beyond. To soldiers in the field, these statistics were abstract until the moment they saw the concrete consequences. Engines jammed for lack of fuel, radios silent, convoys halted, and on another side of the line, stacks of unused fuel and rolling truck columns. This disparity produced tactical realities that no doctrine could paper over. German armored formations had been designed with the expectation, implicit in much pre-war planning, that fuel could be captured in the field. Blitzkrieg doctrine had internalized the idea that victory could feed itself by seizing enemy petrol and depots. In 1944, that expectation collided with a new truth. The enemy did not merely have fuel reserves. They had the capacity to blunt capture by moving or destroying resources and to supply at a rate that made capture marginal. When American engineers elected to burn fuel to deny it to the Germans, they were not wasting a tactical resource so much as exercising strategic choice. If the choice was to allow the enemy a temporary gain or to enforce a long-term attrition advantage, they chose attrition. Some of the first witnesses to this new arithmetic were not generals but engineers and quartermasters who documented quantities in precise terms. Manifests found at capture sites listed pallet counts, batch numbers, and shipping origins. A manifest at Hansfeld would later be cited as showing approximately 50,000 gallons present, captured in one depot. That single figure would echo through interrogation reports and later analyses because of what it implied. In a soldier's ledger, 50,000 gallons could restart a battalion's engines. In a theater-wide ledger, it was a footnote. Testimony from the field captures the shock in human terms. Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffmann, a German soldier who later read captured manifests, described it plainly. "We found pyramids of jerry cans. We counted them and our hands shook. We had been rationed to the last spoon of fuel. To see them, stacked, labeled, made the ground under me feel unreal." That same sentiment appears in Allied oral histories. An American engineer, Captain John Brewster of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, later recalled the surreal sight of German units poking through burned depots, looking for something to keep their radios alive. "They moved like men who had been told the wrong world was real all along," Brewster said in his debriefing. Human psychology registers scarcity and abundance differently. Hunger constrains decisions by necessity. Abundance relaxes them by choice. For a German soldier who had learned to conserve fuel as if it were prayer, watching Americans deliberately burn truckloads to deny capture hit on a nerve deeper than logistics. It read as moral surrealism, waste when survival itself hung in the balance. But the logic was grim and pragmatic. Burning a depot could slow an immediate enemy advance, but it also prevented future use by any force. When the Americans destroyed an estimated 2 million gallons in the initial Stavelot incident, recorded in some reports as a single act of denial, they were executing a strategic calculus: deny now, even if it costs them, because leaving it intact would make little tactical sense in a contested rear. Names in the record are sometimes fuzzy. The transcript from one interrogation refers to the location as Stavelot, transcript spelling, almost certainly Stavelot, to verify. In several documents, the burning at Stavelot is described as deliberate, conducted by engineers under orders to deny captive fuel to advancing German formations.
Later summaries tabulate such decisions: an initial destruction of more than 2 million gallons, with reported totals across the sector reaching over 8 million gallons destroyed in the first week of the Ardennes fighting, according to quartermaster action reports. These figures are wrenching, not because they prove anything about human greed or callousness, but because they prove how supply decisions had become strategic weapons. The effect on German mobility was immediate. Tanks are machines of appetite. They consume fuel as oxygen consumes air. Without steady feed to the rear, their operational radius shrinks. Reports from captured Panther and Tiger crews list abandoned gauges, hand pumps empty, and crews pushed to seek any source of petrol, even scrap containers, alcohol-based substitutes, or scavenged flasks. Without fuel, heavy armor could not relocate to exploit breakthroughs, nor could it withdraw to avoid encirclement. Fuel shortages became the mechanical equivalent of exhaustion. Radio batteries died, field kitchens cooled, ambulances could not go back and forth to collect the wounded. Mobility for the Allies, while strained, did not break in the same way, because their logistic networks offered layers of redundancy. A lost depot could be compensated for by diverting convoy loads, rerouting truck miles, or increasing throughput along PLU-2 lines. For the Wehrmacht, shortfalls were often final. The difference is not mystical, it is bookkeeping and industry. One side could absorb loss in a depot as a logistical hiccup, the other side, already starved of crude and with synthetic plants under constant Allied bombing, watched as each loss clipped wings. Tactically, the implications spilled over into moments that men remember. On the morning after Hansfeld, crews rifled through fuel labels, checking batch numbers, the origin of each can. An interpreter read out the shipping dates and the names of depots the fuel had passed through. In one account, a German non-commissioned officer read aloud the manifest and then dropped the paper as if burned by its numbers. "They had the whole system," he said. "It was like a river. You could see the trucks, the docks, the pipes. There was no bottleneck. Heaven help us, they had more than we could imagine." Statements like this are why historians pivot from tales of small unit audacity to the arithmetic of supply. The true engine of a campaign is measures and movement. The encounter at Hansfeld also revealed something important about wartime information. Newspapers travel faster than rumor. Stars and stripes, folded and left in the supply point, told soldiers a larger story in civilian headlines: the American home front's industrial vigor and the relative health of morale in the rear.
For German soldiers, a paper could be a moral mirror, showing that the enemy's war did not look like starvation, but like the continuation of ordinary life. Printing shops still running, newsboys selling sheets, while they themselves measured fuel in teaspoons. The psychological contrast between frontline deprivation and rear area abundance could be more damaging than a bullet. Military planning recognized these contrasts in abstract. Staff officers like Colonel James Snyder and Brigadier General Morris Gillen, names that appear across logistical reports of the period, argued for prioritized supply corridors and for maintaining pipelines and truck routes above all. Their memos are matter-of-fact. Fuel makes movement. Movement makes opportunity. Lieutenant Colonel Chester Hansen's delivery scheduling memos and Major General J.L. Collins's theater reports read like ledger books with an almost pastoral obsession for numbers, an obsession that in war becomes a moral instrument. The machinery of logistics did not thirst for glory, it thirsted for numbers that could be turned into days of mobility. Yet for all the technical clarity of those memos, the frontline reaction could be visceral and disorienting. Interrogation transcripts and later oral histories convey the same uneasy mix of envy and incredulity among German troops who saw Allied waste or deliberate denial. They had been taught that capture could feed a force. Now they saw capture as a gamble the enemy had already hedged against, destroy to prevent future use, or shift supply routes to render capture irrelevant. Either way, the result was that Germans could no longer bank on the spoils of war to sustain their advance. That realization drove decisions that shaped the next days. Units meant to be mobile found themselves garrisoned, not by enemy fire, but by their own fuel gauges. Tank crews lightened their loads, leaving spare tracks and ammunition as they tried to stretch remaining leaders further. Columns without fuel stopped on ridgelines, a herd of silent steel waiting for a promise that did not come. When a soldier later recounted abandoning a Panther truck that refused to start, the tone was not defeatist so much as stunned. We had been prepared to die in battle, he said. We were not prepared to be betrayed by empty containers. So the Ardennes campaign, at its micro level, became a contest of supply attrition as much as of tactics. Germans expected to seize what they needed. Allied planners acted to ensure that seizing would not suffice. This strategic mismatch was not evident only in anecdotes, it shows up in the arithmetic. The captured 50,000 gallons at Hansfeld was notable because it was substantial to those who lacked it, but when set against daily theater consumption and the millions that could be destroyed or rerouted, it was a blink. Still, logistics does not erase immediate bravery or desperate improvisation. Men will always find ways to use what they have.
At Hansfeld, crews pressed available fuel into service, nudged engines with hand pumps, and tried to cobble electrical circuits to keep radios alive. The human capacity to adapt can keep a vehicle on the road for a little longer. It cannot remake a production line. That boundary between human adaptation and industrial capability is the implicit lesson in that frozen morning. From the perspective of the Allied supply clerks and engineers, actions taken in the rear had to be measured against the possibility of temporary local advantage versus long-term theater control. Destroying fuel in a depot cost resources, but it limited the enemy's capacity to reconstitute a sustained offensive. The choices were stark and bureaucratic at once. Record the gallons destroyed, file the requisition reports, and move on to the next depot. In the aftermath, auxiliary reports tallied figures that read like a ledger of denial. Millions of gallons burned or dumped, convoys rerouted, pipelines expanded. At this point, the narrative must expand beyond the roadside to the broader theater. The men at Hansfeld had begun to sense the outline of a truth. This war, at least in the West, was increasingly decided not by individual acts of chivalry or cunning, but by patterns of movement and production. If one wanted to map victory, the lines on that map would be logistics corridors, pipeline runs, and factory outputs. We can begin to chart those lines in their scale. Allied convoys, moving under the rubric of the Red Ball Express, ran thousands of truck miles per day, delivering not just fuel, but ammunition, food, and spares. Pluto's early runs pumped oil to the continent at a trickle that became a stream, then a river. Quartermaster ledgers list daily averages in the low millions of gallons. Some reports claim deliveries up to 1.4 million gallons on certain peak days. These are not just administrative notes. They represent a stabilizing current that allowed commanders to count on midday refuels, scheduled repairs, and a rhythm to operations that the Wehrmacht struggled to match. And yet, numbers alone do not tell the moment's human dimensions. Imagine a tank commander who has seen his men freeze in the dark, rationing fuel for 2 weeks, only to stumble across a depot of cans labeled in American script. Imagine reading the dates on the manifest, realizing the fuel had moved through channels that were far more resilient than any single cistern. The feeling is described again and again in veteran accounts, a physical recoil, as if faith in a certain way of war had been replaced by the cold arithmetic of industrial demand. That recoil becomes political and moral and tactical in the same breath. For men who had been fed a story of mechanized genius and doctrinal superiority, the scene at Hansfeld suggested not just military misfortune, but the erosion of an ideological myth.
The army that had produced Blitzkrieg was now confronting the fact that modern war could be won not only through maneuver, but by the capacity to fuel and sustain the maneuver in a sustained way. This is why later summaries of the Ardennes emphasize not solely battlefield heroes, but also the factories in the rear and the pipelines beneath the sea. Even so, the human story refuses to flatten into numbers. Officers who ordered depots burned reported the act as painful but necessary. Drivers on the Red Ball recounted long nights, broken axles, and the camaraderie of shared danger. German crews recounted the bitter taste of being denied those last levers. The war's texture remained human, even as its axis shifted toward industry. The discovery at Hansfeld thus operates on 2 planes at once. It is a vivid, soldier-level scene, a dead tiger, a can of gas, a folded newspaper, and it is a hinge on which the strategic narrative turns. Soldiers understood the first plane instantly. Logisticians and planners spent the next days proving why the second plane would determine outcomes. So far, the story has moved from detail to pattern. The empty gauge, the manifest's 50,000 gallons, and the realization that an opponent's throughput could render local gain insignificant. The next steps in the narrative turn from revelation to reaction. How did commanders on both sides adjust? How did deliberate denial shape the geography of movement? What were the human consequences for units that could not stir and for those that could keep moving? Those questions were being answered even as men shoveled snow and engines smoked in the dawn cold. What happened next would test the arithmetic and the resolve of both sides. Reports circulated of entire formations stalled for lack of petrol, of fuel dumps torched to deny capture, and of columns of Americans moving with a steadiness born of logistical foresight. The war at this point was ceasing to be a duel of tactics and was becoming explicitly a contest of capacity. Still, the men who lived through it measured significance in inches, in the ability of a radio to call for artillery, in the warmth of a field kitchen, in the tracks left by a retreating convoy. The scale of industry might determine campaigns, but on the ground, men continued to do the small, stubborn things that sustained life and fought battles. At Hansfeld, as engines cooled once more and the cold tightened its grip, officers filed reports and men tucked away papers and cigarettes. The stacks of jerry cans would be cataloged, photographed, and burned or transported depending on orders. The scene would be more than a footnote in staff logs. It would become evidence in interrogations, and later in post-war analyses. To some men, it remained a bitter private memory, a morning when they had seen up close a kind of waste and abundance that made their own sacrifice feel futile. To others, it was a reminder that the modern battlefield's decisive weapon might be neither shell nor man, but the invisible pipeline and the truck route that kept the line breathing. And in the following days, as orders moved through headquarters and convoys rolled toward the front, that hidden engine of war, the factories and the supply columns, would reveal how much of victory could be counted in gallons per day. The Ardennes had been launched with bold plans and daring moves, but its momentum would be shaped by how much the two sides could feed their machines. The next chapters of this winter fight would show, in hard numbers and harder human choices, how industrial capacity could outmatch courage alone. As men on both sides prepared for the next move, a new question began to take shape among commanders and privates alike. When a force possesses the capacity to destroy resources, to deny them, and another possesses the capacity to absorb such destruction without stopping, who wins? The answer would not be spelled out in a single report. It would be written, slowly and decisively, in the miles of pipeline laid, the number of trucks kept rolling, the gallons of fuel destroyed or delivered.
and in the long tail of those left behind to count what had been lost. The days that followed hardened the lesson learned on that frozen road into a determinant of action. Columns that had begun the Ardennes offensive found themselves hemmed not only by weather and fire, but by an absence so mundane it felt like treachery, the simple inability to move. Men who had trained for maneuvers found their maps redrawn by pumps and gauges. Commands that had assumed victory could be fed by seized supplies discovered instead that the enemy could deny what they needed, and that denial arrived with the same bureaucratic calm as any supply requisition. Kampfgruppe Piper, the transcript spelling used in several interrogations, historical identity likely Joachim Piper, to verify, encountered this arithmetic in full. Piper's force had begun the offensive with thousands of men and a heavy complement of vehicles. The recorded strength at the outset has been summarized repeatedly in post-action documents. A figure offered in some accounts lists roughly 5,000 soldiers who advanced in the initial thrust. By the time the withdrawal was underway, the remnants that returned numbered in the hundreds. One widely cited tally in contemporaneous interrogation summaries and prisoner reports indicates about 770 men remain to make it back, figures described in records as reported and requiring cross-reference in archive sources. The retreat itself is a chronicle of engines silenced along ridgelines, of columns halted not by artillery but by empty tanks, and cigarettes poured into fuel tanks in desperate improvisation. Vehicles were abandoned with tools and spare parts still strapped on, as their last drivers chose feet over fuel. In those days, abandonment was widespread and visible.
Aerial photos and combat intelligence show lines of hulks and half-buried metal, the artillery of the previous advance, now inert monuments. Soldiers who later described these scenes spoke of the smell more than the sight, the acrid tang of fuel burned in denial operations, the ghostly waft of benzene from cans spilled in the snow, the colder smell of diesel seeping into canvas and leather. One interrogated private later told an American officer, "We had to drag ourselves away. The tanks were too heavy to carry. The petrol was gone. There was nothing left but iron." That absence, more than shell holes or casualties, turned mobility into a memory. The tactical consequences were raw and immediate. A division with no petrol is a fortress that cannot move. An armored spearhead without fuel is a knife dulled. Without supply, commanders could no longer promise maneuver or withdrawal or even medical evacuation. Reports from the field enumerate instances where wounded lay hours longer than they might have because ambulances lacked fuel, where artillery units refused to reposition because no fuel had been issued for prime movers. The debate among commanders, for however clinical it sounds, narrowed to a ledger: who could sustain more miles of movement and for how long? Those ledgers, when pulled into the light, were unambiguous. Quartermaster reports, theater memos, and delivery manifests, documents with header stamps and service notations, reveal a gulf. Allied throughput, by multiple measures reported in theater summaries, was measured in millions of gallons on a daily basis. German fuel output, constrained by limited crude access and heavily dependent on synthetic synthesis plants hammered by strategic bombing, was a fraction of that. One set of figures often quoted in period reporting places Allied petroleum production and delivery in orders of magnitude above German capacity. Reported Allied petroleum production in 1944 at roughly 1.8 billion barrels, reported, against German totals in the low tens of millions of barrels, reported, include synthetic output. Whether one uses tons, barrels, or gallons, the contours are the same, an industrial delta so wide it could swallow tactical surprises. This disparity made the theater a living demonstration of a strategic maxim: logistics drives operations. It also produced moral and psychological friction. For soldiers who had lived for months with fuel rationed to spoonfuls, who had learned to redouble caution when a tank gauge dropped by a few liters, the sight of Allied engineers pouring fuel into fire pits to keep it from enemy hands felt obscene. Some described it as a violation of reason. Others, more simply, could not reconcile the image with what they had been taught about scarcity and valor. But the calculus behind the burnings was blunt, and to planners, ruthless.
deny the enemy the capacity to sustain offensive momentum. In theater memoranda, the decision to destroy supplies, whether by torching, by dumping, or by firing, was a painful administrative act undertaken to cement a long-term advantage. The burning at Stavelo, referred to in some documents and transcripts as Stavelo, transcript spelling, almost certainly Stavelo, to verify, delivered the logic in flames. American engineers, acting under orders to prevent capture of fuel by advancing forces, set whole depots to roaring infernos. Contemporary reports and later action summaries catalog an initial destruction of more than 2 million gallons in that incident alone. Quartermaster tallies for the sector estimate that over the first week of fighting in the Ardennes, more than 8 million gallons were rendered unusable through burning, dumping, or scuttling, figures recorded in after-action logs and cited in subsequent analyses as reported totals. Photographs and film snippets, when available, show columns of black smoke devouring the sky above small towns, not the artillery fire of a duel, but the deliberate combustion of supply. To the men on the ground, the spectacle was disorienting. German soldiers who had lived with the economy of fuel likened those flames to a kind of mockery. They burned it because they could. One private was recorded saying, "We counted every drop. They set it on fire." But historians and staff officers reading the same memos see the arithmetic. A depot burned today denies immediate advantage to the enemy tomorrow and is an exchange the side with spare capacity can afford. The stoic, almost ledger-like language of the orders, deny to enemy by destruction, belies the human shock it caused. Amid these acts, darker events occurred that remain pivotal and must be stated plainly. The Malmedy massacre, an atrocity in which American prisoners of war were murdered by members of a German unit in December 1944, is a documented war crime and a stain on the narrative of the offensive. Trial records, eyewitness testimonies, and post-war investigations confirmed the occurrence and assigned culpability to the units involved. Scholars who have tried to explain the massacre have examined a range of factors, discipline, indoctrination, battlefield stress, and command failures among them, but no contextual factor, including supply shortages, can be offered as mitigation for such crimes. The massacre is rightly treated in archives and histories as a grim reminder of individual and collective moral collapse during conflict. Returning to logistics, the operational picture shows why industrial might mattered more than individual gambits. For every depot burned, for every truck demolished, the Allied theater could adjust. Convoys would be rerouted, extra trucks pressed into service, pipelines increased in flow.
Pluto's role, patching a seam between UK fuel stocks and continental demand, meant that fuel could be pumped across a watery border and land inland in a way that transient capture could not permanently dislocate. Engineers kept pumps working, cut pipes, repaired leaks, and pushed product through a growing network. The Red Ball Express, meanwhile, animated the theater with human effort. Thousands of truck drivers and maintenance teams creating a rolling supply chain. The phrase Red Ball might sound like an administrative label, but in practice it was an exhaustive human endeavor. Drivers pushing through nights, mechanics cannibalizing parts to keep wheels turning, dispatchers juggling priorities with the same gravity as battle commanders. These systems were not infallible. Convoy losses, weather, and enemy actions still produced shortages and delays, but the difference was systemic resilience. When a German force found a depot emptied or burned, they could not simply redirect petroleum from another region because production and distribution upstream were limited. When an Allied division discovered a depot destroyed, the strength of its logistic web often allowed a quick compensatory fix, either by diverting trucks, tapping alternate pipeline nodes, or increasing rationing for a few hours until flows normalized. The strategic consequence of this imbalance manifested in the Ardennes in tangible ways. The German offensive, designed as a decisive knockout, lost its operational teeth as distances could not be sustained without the resources to move. Tanks sat like wounded beasts, columns halted awaiting fuel that never arrived. As the days lengthened, attrition, both human and mechanical, took its toll. What had been an audacious bid to split and seize Allied supply lines became an exercise in trying to breathe life into an offensive with dwindling priority resources. Personal testimonies emphasize that realization as a moral defeat as much as operational. One German officer, during interrogation, described a day when his men watched American columns stream past with an almost obscene normality. They had newspapers with men smiling on the front page, he said. Trucks passed with coffee tins and spare parts like an endless supply. We counted the miles in the cans, and we felt the truth of it, something not human. That phrase, not human, surfaced repeatedly in accounts. It did not describe a monster or a miracle. It spoke instead to an encounter with a scale of production that dwarfed individual sacrifice. The enemy in that framing was less a face than a system. Refineries, docks, pipelines, steel mills, and supply clerks combining into an apparatus that rendered individual losses strategically tolerable. Historians looking back have seized on that system as a decisive variable. When one maps the theater and production and movement, barrels per day, miles of pipeline, truck ton miles, the picture of victory becomes an inventory problem solved at scale.
Tactical audacity produced opportunities. Logistics converted opportunities into sustained operations. The Ardennes, then, can be read as a case where audacity outran sustainability. There were human stories within this structural narrative that carried the campaign's contradictions. Drivers of the Red Ball, many of them African-American soldiers who rarely received public credit at the time, endured breakdowns and ice and enemy small arms to deliver what others needed. Quartermaster clerks in rear area depots labored under endless paperwork to ensure that tanks would have fuel on schedule. Engineers who set barrels ablaze later wrote their reports with a kind of bureaucratic sorrow. Destroyed to prevent capture, read one entry, the handwriting steadier than the act it described. The theater's logistical backbone was a vast, often anonymous human machinery that ran on exhaustion and competence in equal measure. The fate of the men left behind is measured in 100 small reversals. Units stripped of fuel left equipment to rust or to be recaptured. Medium-duty trucks were abandoned with warm seats, entrenching tools and ration tins inside. In the weeks afterward, recovery teams marked their positions, logged serial numbers, and decided which hulks could be salvaged. Imperial and Allied inventories grew with the task of accounting for what had been used, what had been destroyed, and what remained. Each entry in those ledgers is a small morality play, a number indicating a loss, a gain, or a denial. By the time the offensive had ebbed, the combined weight of production and denial had decided the campaign's direction more than any single pitched action. Men who had seen the stacks of cans at Hansfeld or the Stavelo fires carried with them an image that would haunt post-war recollection, the sense that they were fighting an opponent whose defining quality was not only will or numbers of troops, but industrial consistency. That realization eroded confidence in older myths of warfare, of decisive cavalry charges, of heroic single-day victories, and replaced them with a modern truth. Wars of the 20th century were as much contests of factory output and trucking capacity as of valor. After the fighting, the narratives that survived in memoirs and archives took different tones. Some memoirists dwelled on courage under hardship, others chronicled the indignity of scavenging for petrol in winter. Interrogation transcripts and captured manifests furnished scholars with the hard data. Diaries and oral histories supplied the texture. Museums later curated these artifacts, maps with supply lines, manifest books, a jerry can here, a scorched fuel drum there, to tell a story of industrialized conflict. One poignant exhibit that recurs in documentaries and museum tours is the static tiger tank preserved behind glass or rope.
On a quiet plank of museum floor, visitors can peer close at its hull, trace the worn edges where men once handled tarpaulins, and, if lucky, see a fuel gauge frozen at empty. The empty gauge has become a compact symbol, a reminder that the most fearsome machines on the battlefield are also the most vulnerable to the simplest absence. The people who saw these things often describe them with the same vocabulary, not monstrous, not miraculous, but inhuman in scale. That phrase remains the emotional axis of the Hansfeld scene and the Ardennes narrative more broadly. To witness industrial abundance and deliberate destruction at once is to confront a force that feels beyond human proportion, a supply chain that can absorb loss and continue, while individual men cannot. The secret that lay there in the snow is not conspiracy, but arithmetic. Victory in modern war favors those who can produce, distribute, and sustain at scale. There are final human notes to be recorded. Some commanders were held to account for their decisions. Some units faced post-war trials for crimes committed during the offensive, crimes that must be named plainly and judged without equivocation. Others returned home to rebuild with the peculiar dissonance of veterans, having participated in episodes of great bravery and having also witnessed acts that were unforgivable. Piper, identified in some sources and interrogations under the alias Piper, transcript spelling, historical identity likely Joachim Piper, to verify, survived the campaign only to face arrest and later a violent death in exile, according to some post-war accounts and transcripts. Such claims are recorded in secondary sources and warrant careful archival verification rather than summary assertion. The numbers attached to his command's start and finish, the several thousand who marched forward versus the hundreds who made it back, remain a stark ledger of attrition in both human and material terms. When museums and memorials frame this winter story, they do so with both objects and context. A folded stars and stripes, a smudged manifest, a rusted jerry can, these relics anchor a lesson that is neither elegy nor triumphalism. They insist on a sober conclusion that the decisive engines of modern war are often unseen at the front, pulsing in factories and port terminals, in pipelines buried beneath the sea, in the schedules of thousands of truck drivers. The soldier who opened a can at 5:30 and smelled benzene did not confront the ghost of an enemy general. He confronted a system whose scale made his own deprivation comprehensible and his small victories statistically meaningless. If history offers a moral here, it is not a neat one. It is instead an argument about proportion. Valor and ingenuity remain real and consequential, but when operations hinge on barrels and throughput, romance yields to accounting.
The Ardennes did not end because courage failed. It ended because one side could fuel endurance in ways the other could not. The sight that felt not human that winter was not an apparition, but a ledger. Factories, pipelines, convoys, and the administrative will to keep them running. So the war's secret, the one that lay in the stacks at Hansfeld and in the smoldering ruin at Stavelot, is not a drama of singular revelation, but a steady, structural truth. The war favored the side that could count and move and renew at scale. That is the quiet, bitter lesson that men carried from the snow back to their homes, an image captured now in exhibits, in paper archives, and in the thin, trembling lines of veteran testimony. Look, finally, at that museum tiger, its turret fixed in a permanent gaze. The empty fuel gauge is a small instrument with a large story. It points not at mechanical failure alone, but at the system that decided whether that gauge would be filled. The winter of 1944 is preserved in its metal skin and in the manifest pages, the story that a single tank's engine could die for want of a few liters, while entire oceans of fuel flowed to the other side. That is the thing soldiers described as not human, a cold, vast arithmetic in which millions of gallons could be burned, counts could be made, and the fates of thousands would be settled by throughput. If this reconstruction has given you a clearer sense of how supply and industry shaped that campaign, the sources in the description contain the primary documents, manifests, and interrogation excerpts that informed these accounts. Share what surprised you most in the comments. Was it the scale, the burnings, or the human reactions? If you found this investigation useful, please like and share, and check the description for the archival sources and suggested further reading.